Welcome back. Tenants and Neighbors is a grassroots membership organization collaborating closely with tenants to empower them in preserving and safeguarding affordable housing throughout New York State. Since its inception, the organization has been highly successful in preserving thousands of units of affordable housing and bolstering tenant rights at the city, state, and federal levels. Joining us is the executive director of Tenants Neighbors, Genesis Aquino. Genesis, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting.
Now, can you talk about the organization Tenants and Neighbors and its two affiliations?
So, Tenants and Neighbors is we are a 501c4 nonprofit organization founded in 1974 for the sole purpose of doing advocacy at the state level to strengthen tenants' rights in Albany. As you may know, New York City has no power over its housing regulations, so it all depends on Albany. The organization was formed because of that. And then the C3 is the organization in charge of organizing and doing grassroots work to to uh, create independent tenant associations in at-risk affordable housing, and also to provide leadership development and technical assistance to tenants who want to organize their buildings. And we are mostly based, in New York City.
Now, I understand that the organization was obviously created many years ago, but can you just talk about, maybe what inspired the creation of it? What was that moment that, people in New York knew that this was something that needed to be around in the city?
Like I said, so we, especially the C3 part of the organization, which is to organize, was founded because there was a big need to protect average affordable housing. So we were formed initially to organize in buildings that are federally subsidized, basically project-based Section 8. A lot of these buildings were still are being basically converted into market rate, right? Being bought by predatory equity investors. Um, and after they were bought, oftentimes tenants were left without the subsidy, right? For example, if a tenant who live in a project-based Section 8 building is paying $1,000 for the, let's say, two-bedroom apartment, once the building is bought by predatory equity investors, then they'll lose the subsidy, right? So the rent will be $3,000. So it's very likely that the people who live in that neighborhood will be displaced, and the neighborhood will be getting gentrified because of the lack of protection to that type of affordable housing. As the year passed, we started organizing in other type of housing like rent stabilized and rent control apartments, and also federally and state subsidized Mishalama co-ops, which were also being lost due to lack of investment from the government.
Now, you mentioned gentrification, and I think it's so important. Now, I know that many of us probably have heard the term before, but for those who aren't as aware, can you just talk about gentrification and how it's actually affecting so many communities in New York?
Yeah, again, the gentrification is really caused by the imbalance between the tenants and the real estate industry that have a lot of power and a lot of money to leverage legislation, unlike most tenants, right, who are mostly poor and working class, low and moderate income people, right, who are maybe unlikely to be connected to resources and have power when it comes to legislation. So um, I lost my train of thought. I went too far, but yeah, gentrification again, the imbalance between the real estate industry and uh, low and moderate income tenants. And it's usually caused because we don't happen to own uh, the housing in which we live, and we have very little control over it. And also, as a collective or as individuals, we don't have power to, for example, to donate $1 million to the governor and have influence over how Albany or the state or the city administration regulates housing. So that causes displacement in our communities. So what we do is organize at the building level, but also form coalition between the tenants who have same landlords and tenants who um, want to organize at the city level and build coalitions so that we can build power to change that and preserve affordability in our communities. Most of the time, people who are being displaced are people of color, black and brown people in particular, and people who happen to be immigrant or have different intersections that are created by this economic system or in systems of oppression uh, that have been built throughout the history of this country. So it is a sad situation, and it's being accelerated each day even more because of the lack of affordable housing being constructed and the lack of protection to preserve the current affordable housing that we have.
Now, can you talk about some of the work you do to educate, some of the communities that you just mentioned, especially those who may speak different languages? I'm sure that can also possibly, be another barrier or another challenge for people who are facing these issues. So, can you just talk about some of the work you do to assist them or at least educate them in this field?
Yeah, most of the tenants that come to Tenants and Neighbors, they come because they are living in deplorable conditions. They're facing harassment, they're facing lack of repairs. Some of them, again, they're about, their building is about to lose their subsidy. So what we do is that we train them and provide leadership development so that they can run their own independent tenant association. So in some cases, that means helping tenants form bylaws, helping tenants run and facilitate their own meetings. Sometimes it means helping tenants incorporate their tenant association so that they can become themselves a non-profit organization and receive funding and collect funding so that they can run their meetings. And oftentimes, that also means training tenants so that they can speak to media and that they can learn how to lobby and advocate for legislation and uh, policy reforms at the city and state and federal level so that they can have power and decide over their lives and determine the future for their communities. So that's the type of leadership development that we do. So providing that, yeah.
Now, I also wanted to expand. I know that oftentimes when we talk about tenants, we're usually talking about rent. And, we're talking about it in like a monetary way. But, I recently had the privilege of going out and learning about so many people's experience where the buildings just weren't even up to standard. So they were paying rent. But let's say, they didn't have clean water, or the building was infested with rats and rodents and stuff like that. Does your organization also help with letting them understand that they have rights to speak out against that?
Exactly. That's the main part of organizing. So we help tenants understand what are their rights. We also connect tenants to legal representations so that they can sue their landlord in housing court and fight for repairs and against harassment, but also provide technical assistance so that they can build power, right? And make collective decision for their communities. But again, most of the people that call tenants and neighbors are people who are facing issues at, at the individual level, people who are experiencing eviction, people who are living in bad conditions, or people simply who don't know when or how to sign their lease, how much the rent should increase. So that's it. Yeah, we provide a legal resource for them so that they can be empowered also at the individual level and able to remain in their homes.
No, I think that's so important, the legal aspect of it. I think a lot of people often think, obviously, protesting and making your voice heard is very important, but there is a legal side that can often be intimidating for some people. I guess from your work experience, can you talk about what that process may look like, and possibly give advice to people who are currently going through that right now?
Sorry, would you?
Hello? Okay, are you able to hear me now?
I hear you now.
Okay, great. So I'll just repeat the question. So I basically asked, the legal aspect is a very important part of this. And I think sometimes people often get very intimidated by this. Do you have any advice for people who are currently going through that? And, what are the steps that they should take in regard to, I guess, beginning that legal process?
I mean, the first thing is seeking assistance, right? Most tenants don't know in what type of apartment or housing they live. So learning in which type of housing you live is is the first step, right? If you live in a very stabilized apartment, for example, like almost 2 million New Yorkers, we have a lot of tenant rights, especially right that was strengthened in 2019. If you live in a market rate apartment, it's completely different, right? So learning that first step is crucial to moving forward. And then uh, from there, we can know what rights you have on that, right? And then seeking, uh, I would say, assistance to get legal representation. In New York City, we have the right to counsel for people who are low income. And you may qualify for legal representation if you are facing eviction. And I would say one of the most important thing, at least for our organizing model in tenants and neighbors, is building coalition with your neighbors. It's very likely that if you are facing, um, let's say, a repair issue, very likely your neighbors also experiencing the same thing. So talking to your neighbors is important because there is power in numbers, and you are likely to win a case when you have evidence that other people in the building are facing the same issue.
Now, I know that you mentioned something happened in 2019. I'm not sure if this is the exact same thing that I'm thinking of, but I understand that on June 14th, 2019, the Upstate Downstate Housing Alliance sparked changes to New York State rent regulation system in the past 20 years. Can you tell us a little bit more about that happening?
Yeah, so Tenants and Neighbors is a leading member of the Downstate Upstate Alliance. We formed that alliance so that we can build strength uh, in the state, right? And in 2019, basically had the strongest victory for tenants in over 20 years for the state of New York. So we strengthened the rent regulation laws that impact people who live in rent stabilized and rent control apartments, but also implemented or strengthened some of the rights for people who are market rate based unregulated tenants. Um, for example, one of the changes that happened in 2019 was shortening the time for MCIs, major capital improvement. In the past, if your landlord had a major capital improvement in the building, for example, they got a new boiler, they were able to charge the tenant for the rest of their tenancy for that boiler per room. After 2019, that was limited to 30 years. Still a long time. We wanted to eliminate it completely, but that's what happened. Another thing that happened in 2019 is that we got rid of the vacancy decontrol, right? If you move into a new apartment, there were loopholes in the law that allow the landlord to destabilize the apartment, but that's not possible no more. And landlords can no longer charge 20% or 18% to the new tenant that comes into to a rent stabilized apartment. So there's a lot of loopholes that were closed that makes it hard for predatory landlords to displace people and harass tenants and hike the rents. So it was a major victory, you know. Unfortunately, a lot of tenants don't know that they have those rights. So some of the work that we are doing as a coalition for the whole state is continuing to educate people about what rights they have on that, because that's the main um, point to preventing displacement in our communities.
Now, can you talk about the four leadership committees? And I understand that some of them consist of like rent stabilization, rent control, but can you talk about them a little bit more?
Yeah, so tenants and neighbors believe in um, we believe that the best method to fighting gentrification and displacement is by building a movement of grassroots tenant leaders who are educated and empowered. So after we organize at the building level, where we form tenant association, we engage deeply. We continue to engage deeply in leadership development. So we work closely with our leaders, and we engage in committee work. So if tenant leaders live in a rent stabilized building, we work together um, to basically have an influence over the campaigns and the legislative reforms that we work on at the city and the state level. Same thing with the HUD Leadership Committee. Most of those are people who live in Project Based Section A, federally subsidized building, and we have to do advocacy at the federal level. Um, so it's basically that empowering tenants to take control over their lives and their communities beyond the work that they do at the building level, but also to be ambassadors of the tenant movement, right? As an executive director, I am just one voice, but we believe that people who are directly impacted have uh, the solutions to the problem. So tenants are the solution to the housing crisis and the eviction crisis that we are facing right now.
Well, we have about a minute left. Can you just quickly let me know, like, what are your hopes for the future in regard to so much of the work that you do to support many New Yorkers?
What is the future of the work we do to support New Yorkers?
Hmm.
So right now, one of the things that we're looking forward to is reforming the Rent Guideline Board. Our members are very excited to work on that. Right now, the board is completely chosen by the mayor of the city of New York, and our tenant leaders believe that the board should be more democratic. The city council should have a say on that. And there should be more tenant representatives sitting on the table. Right now, there's only two tenant representatives, five public members who also happen to be on the side of landlords. And it has been like that for a long time. Even though the Rent Guideline Board was formed to create fair adjustment to the rents, it has not worked that way, right? For the past, I don't know, 40 years, it has increased the rent, with the exception of the De Blasio administration that froze, the rent a few times. But it has not been that way throughout its history. So that's something that we are excited about. In the last year, we were fighting hard for good cost eviction. Good cost eviction is a bill to ensure that people who live in unregulated apartment also have uh, the right to remain in their homes and fight rent hikes. Right now, if you live in let's say a 2-3 family home, um, or a small building with less than 4 apartments, who is not a building that is not regulated, the landlord can decide to evict you whenever they want.
Hmm.
That's something that we believe is not fair, and we work really hard for the governor to sign this bill. So we look forward working on that in the future. There's a lot of other legislation, like the Housing Assets Voucher Program. It's a program that kind of mirrors the Section
I'm
8
so
program.
sorry. We're running out of time, but I truly appreciate you taking the time to speak with us about this. And hopefully, maybe we can come back again and talk further about this. But thank you once again.
Thank you so much.
We have to take a quick break. We'll be back right after this.